I am wearing two hats today. I am the director for the Center for Social Policy Studies, which is one of the collaborative one of the organizations putting on this panel today. And I'm also the principal investigator for the GETSPA project, which is the second partner. And of course, there's ICTD as well. I would want to just do a quick housekeeping thing. The GETSPA project is Pan-African. We have 31 researchers. We have researchers in 31 countries in all 5 regions, Northern, Southern, West, and Central Africa. Some of whom speak French, some speak Lusophone. We have translations from English to French. So I want to check to make sure that the interpreters are online and that folks who are tuned into the interpretation channel can hear them all right. We're good? Great. So today we have a panel that looks at taxation from a social policy perspective. And we're going to have 5 presentations, 4 empirical, and I think of mine as an introductory presentation for non-social policy types and also for our social policy students who are also online today. So I'm going to go right into it. I just checked to see that my PowerPoint can be seen both by in-house participants as well as by those online. Yes, we're good. Thank you. All right. So as I said, I'm at both the Center for Social Policy Studies at the University of Ghana and with the GETSPA project, which is hosted at the University of Ghana, specifically in the Institute of African Studies. And both CSPS and GETSPA aim to promote a broader vision of social policy than currently pertains both in policymaking circles and even often in academia. And this understanding of social policy is consistent with our interest in today's panel on taxation. Now, Kwadwo Opoku here is going to be representing CSPS. So let me talk in this introduction about the work that GETSPA does to try to transform the discourses, cultures, and practices of social policy making, and why we were very interested in being co-host for today's conversation. As I said, this is something that social policy researchers already appreciate, and I'm sure many of you already know, but I think it's worth reminding people about the challenges to making sure that the social policies that we develop and that we implement are actually transformative. So the 2 challenges to this transformative approach, and when we say transformative approach in the GETSPA project, which is part of our name, I didn't spell out the full thing, is gender equitable and transformative social policy for post-COVID. The idea is social policy that actually has the chance of helping people to flourish in all kinds of ways and removing structural and other barriers to their ability to thrive in their lives. Now, currently, what we have is a very diminished, a very narrow version of social policy. First is this notion of social protection as social policy, where we have really a piecemeal approach to social policy. So we have cash transfers, health insurance, microfinance, school feeding, subsidies for school fees, reform of social security systems in very limited ways. These are all programs that would be very familiar, I know, to a Ghanaian audience, and I suspect to audiences in other African countries and even outside of Africa, generally in the global south, because these are the kinds of projects that have been diffused in different countries, again, as a very minimalist approach to social policy making. It emphasizes poverty rather than any other issue that people deal with, including questions of equality and social solidarity. It targets the deserving poor rather than having a more universalist approach. Now, a slightly more expansive version of this is what the ILO has proposed, where you have social assistance like the cash transfers and so on. But you should also have social insurance that helps people with social security, for instance. And then also interventions into the labor market to try to regulate labor relations. And as I've pointed out on the PowerPoint, social assistance is the most common with cash transfers. Social insurance is less common, and again, it's tied to formal employment often. So the vast majority of workers in the informal economies are left out. And then there is obviously in this neoliberal environment, not so much enthusiasm on the part of the state to actually regulate the market because this is seen as interfering with market forces. So that is one problem. And that first problem is really a problem that comes out of the second challenge, this pitting of economic policy against social policy in a competition where social policy is secondary, is residual, is seen as consumption and charity rather than an investment that can actually help to make people's lives better, and an investment in social policy that could even help with what we think of as economic policy. And doesn't obviously look at gender and other equalities. I don't want to rehearse how we came here. I think many people in the field of social policy, social development, or development generally would be very, very aware, will recognize that while this has always been a force, this neoliberal approach in the African continent, we we saw the 1980s with the economic reforms, what people here like to call the structural adjustment programs, as a real turning point and a moment when this neoliberal approach to development really took hold and took roots. And I don't think that we have been able to come out of this neoliberal market-driven paradigm which moved the responsibility for our well-being from communities and the states to the market. So that now what is left for social policy making to do is to deal with the fallout of market-driven policies with the deficits and people who are left behind. So that's how you then get social policy as being social protection, just a way to up after. And that's another point. While the orthodox approach to economics um, privileges the market as the central actor, it still fails to recognize that markets are at heart also political and social institutions with highly unequalizing tendencies that require some form of regulation by the state. So the GETSPA corrective to this, these misunderstandings and misconceptions of what social policy is one, to recognize, we want to, even if we can just move people to recognizing that economic and social policy should work together to produce well-being. Well-being is usually thought of as the goal of social policy, but I've always found it kind of an anemic term. So I like human flourishing. It just has more, sounds more aspirational, doesn't it? Flourish and thriving. If we can even move policymakers to that perspective, I think we would think we have done something. But really, what we would like to see ultimately is for people to understand that economic policy is actually a subset of social policy. So that's our more radical expectations. So in the GETSPA project, we explore economic paradigms and policies that are consistent with values of equity and social justice, and how economic policies can be more progressive to produce transformative social outcomes. So that is one thing that we do there as a corrective. Another obviously complementary goal is to have a more expansive view of social policy. If you're thinking of social policy, not just as social protection, then you want to think of it. Kandawire has famously presented it. This is a quote that we use as the starting point of our conception of social policy in the GETSPA project, where it looks at the redistributive effects of economic policy, questions about protection of people from the vagaries of the markets and changing circumstances of age, where social policy will look to enhance the productive potential of members of society and seek to reconcile the burden of reproduction with that of other social. So in effect, we think of these as the four functions of social policy. We've added social cohesion. William Additioner, another African-based social policy scholar, has brought to Ndika Mkandawire's framework. So here, action and reproduction deal with work and livelihoods, policies around produce, but also policies on labor relations and protections. Reproduction, we think of still as work, even though it is often not acknowledged and not rewarded monetarily. But social reproduction is just all the ways in which we maintain society. It can be literal reproducing of children, the physical process, but also thinking about policies that will address gender imbalances in the responsibility for care and domestic work, investment in providing infrastructures and technologies for such work, which became a big thing in COVID times when we realized how much work women in particular do in homes and so on. And then policies that promote more equitable gender division of care and domestic work. And also even policies that will socialize care, especially elder care in these times when demographic profiles are skewing older. There's redistribution, which I think makes sense and obviously would involve taxation as well as cash transfers also, obviously, and social protection and so on. Let me move on quickly. So these are guys that catalyze and support structural transformation in informal, non-industrialized economies, and how to have social policies that address different kinds of inequalities, gender as well as class, location, even generational. So just briefly why we would be interested in taxation. I hope that it should be obvious from what we've explained as our interest, as our cause, our project. We are interested in taxation. We are interested in other economic issues. We have, for instance, commissioned a few papers on the debt crisis that is gripping a lot of African countries. So obviously, first, because we've established that economic policy has social implications. One obvious way, and maybe direct, that economic policy instruments such as taxes can mobilize domestic resources to finance social provisioning. So it will take care of at least two of these functions that we've talked about. Reportedly, when we have domestic resources to fund social policies, there's more national ownership of these policies, there's more independence to withstand donor or external capture of policies. I say purportedly because in Ghana, we had recently a promise from our government that if we all submitted to the electronic levy, then we wouldn't have to go back to the IMF for the seventh time. And here we are with the IMF for another round of austerity program. Taxation can also be used as a social policy instrument to achieve redistribution, which is obviously also important. And then tax revenues can also boost production, employment creation. So this is just a quick way of showing why taxation matters on all the four functions of policy that GETSPA and the Center for Social Policy Studies are both trying to promote through research and through advocacy. So thank you. And now I will turn over to the folks with the actual empirical research to hopefully buttress everything that I've said. So I want to invite, let me end the slideshow for now, and invite Dr. Kwadwo Opoku to the podium.
Thank you very much, Director. So, Akua is my Director at Center for Social Policy Studies. I am Black Economics, and I work with the center as a research fellow. And I work also on taxation issues, but of course, with redistribution in view, as Director has talked about. So I'm very interested in taxation. And so today I'm looking at beyond the money, how tax policies affect decisions of individuals and businesses. In Ghana, if you contribute about 80% to the compulsory social security, you have about 60% of your income. The government say we won't tax you. Kind of tax, we call it tax incentives. If you are ready not to consume it, but save it for your retirement, because who are working today, they face problem of what in that manner that you expect everybody to be able to save for retirement voluntarily. It doesn't happen. That's why actually it's compulsory that government force people to save, and we want them to save more. But because of self-control problems, they'll just think, oh, I'll save tomorrow, I'll save next year. And by the time they see themselves, they are already retired. And if you don't take care, people that was flourishing, they are doing well, they become a burden to the society. And so government says, okay, I have to do something to compel you to save now. So you can use tax to do that. Then also, the director talk about electronic levy. Whether somebody will do cash payment or do electronic payment can also be determined by tax. So if you impose a tax on somebody who wants to do a transaction and the tax is electronic, it will definitely affect the behavior of that person. If you go to other countries, once you go to a shop, they say if you buy on credit card, they have a discount for you. If you buy on cash, you pay higher amount, and that forces you. So all of these things, tax can affect them. That's individuals. Your decision, whether you pay through electronic, you pay through credit card, or you pay by cash. Then work, whether you work in some jurisdictions where there are tax credits. That's whether people decide to work that extensive and also intensive margins. The amount of money, because some places, it depends on the amount that you make before a tax clock in. So if those tax credits are there, it will decide, oh, I don't need to work 8 hours a day. If I work, the tax will come in and it will affect me. So all those things actually affect how people take decisions concerning hours of work. Then also businesses, tax also affect businesses, the way, the choices that they make. So should they work in the formal sector or informal sector? And their businesses, it is not just dichotomy or binary manner. Businesses not in Africa where part of them operate in the formal sector and part operate in the informal sector. So there are workers who work in the formal sector and there are workers who work in the informal economy within the same firm. So taxes has implication on that. So for example, they may decide to avoid social security. If you formalize, you need to pay. And some aspect of their workers, they may decide to do that, and others will work in the informal sector. And whether you borrow or invest, and location of businesses. And why do we do that? You realize that a lot are here, a lot of businesses are coming here. As you can give tax incentive to locations in the northern region, places that people don't want to go, it's incentive to them. That will inform their behavior. If you set your company in Accra, when your profit, you make your profit, 30% you pay as corporate tax. Now, if there's a tax that take away that one when you operate in the north, then you would think about the location. If should I locate it in Accra or locate it in northern region? And when you do that, it allows those people over there to also have access to employment, which is socially good. And taxes can do this. So I'm going to use two policies in Ghana. So economists talk about whether a tax should be withdrawn, should be scrapped or not. Usually, not based on how it affects people, but whether it is efficient or not. And most efficient taxes are taxes that do not change people's behavior, how they are doing it. So, for example, one of the nice efficient tax is property tax. So you have your building that you are staying in, and government say, I'm taxing you. You are not going to decide not to build the house again. The house is already built. So you won't change the consumption of it, and government is taxing it. So it's a perfect efficient tax. And also a tax that encourage productive activities. So we all know how informal sector is less productive compared to the formal sector. And so you want to move a lot of people to the formal sector. It offers the social protection, the security, and other things. So you want to push more people into that so that when they are weak, when they become older, they'll have this all formal social security available. So we want to push a lot of businesses into that sector. So taxes can affect whether people operate, businesses operate in the formal sector or not. Then also, we want almost everywhere want cashless society because allow us to track things are transparent to track 10 years 10 years transaction. We can easily track it and see all the things that people are doing, the corruption and other things will be helped by if people are operating in the cashless society. And as I say, then also the revenues that can be used for redistribution. So when you look at efficient tax, this is how we look at it. Now, there are two taxes that I'm going to use. So the question is, did the inefficiency E-Levy encourage cash holding and payments? So E-Levy is a tax on when you transfer money through your mobile money or through your bank account, another electronically. And government decided to get revenue through it and they imposed a tax on it. It was 1.5 and it has been reduced to 1%. And I classify it as inefficient because a tax that can push people into socially kind of unacceptable manner in a way, I call it in the sense that people go to use cash. Cash economy is not all that good compared to cashless economy. So if you impose a tax on it, you are telling people that move into this area. I don't want you to be here. So move into that area. And that is what government was trying to do. And when they are doing it, they don't consider policymakers are usually the revenue, they don't consider how it affects people's behavior. And therefore, it was imposed in 2021 by the end of 2022. By the end of that year, if you compare, you can see that in general, the currency outside circulation on the downward trend. That year, we saw that it increased. That tells you that even if it was temporary, it actually affected the way so people started withdrawing cash without transferring them. And that is what we see over here. Then we see year-on-year growth on the same level. You can see that the blue one, it is currency outside. That is the currency that you hold. You can do your transaction using check or using otherwise a tax is imposed on it. We see how the growth rate actually was very high, but during that period, November 2021, immediately the announcement was made. You see how it fell. It was down there. Then from there, December, it started increasing. And so people realize that we don't want to use it. So makers consider how it will affect, the behavior of people. Sometimes it makes it inconsistent with they want a economy, but you impose a tax, the aim of generating the revenue, but you are pushing people to areas you don't want them to be. And that is social unacceptable way. Then there is a tax in Ghana, VAT on electricity. In Ghana, we tax if you are in your house, resident, and if you have your own house, residential electricity, there's a VAT, there's no VAT on it. But businesses that use electricity, there's a tax. There's tax of about 20% on it. So they have to pay when you add all the tax components. You have to pay that one. And consistently, I've seen that something is happening. The economic activity for the years from 2013 to 2023. We see that from 2020, of course, 2020, we knew what happened, the COVID, and so it has not very bad. And you can see that something is also it is happening. People, and what is happening, you will not see that there is something behind it. It's a firm, just that they are operating informally. Tax authorities do not have access to it. It's their house and they are renting it out. So a business operates and is paying a VAT. And if the hotel industry, one of their costs of paying 20% more. That means that if I decide to go to somebody's house and stay there, my cost actually, based on electricity alone, has been reduced by 20%. And therefore, the individual is able to charge a lower amount. And therefore, they are using their house for Airbnb. It's just hotel industry for people to come in. And people prefer that one. And therefore, you have seen that consistently for 4 years. You have seen that the GDP, real GDP, at that sector, at the food accommodation and food sector has actually reduced. Something is behind it, and I'm proposing that the discriminatory VAT on electricity on businesses, but not on households, is a corporate in this one. So what I'm saying is that when we think about taxes, we should think about how it affects individuals and businesses. The way now all two political parties have promised that they are going to withdraw getting tax. Your guess is good as mine. What do you think will be the social effect of this when we take away getting tax? Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm going to invite Matt to come up here. Let me just make sure your PowerPoint is set up. There you go. All right.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm also going to start with just a little housekeeping, which is just to say, on behalf of the ICTD and behalf of all the participants of our teaching, our course on researching tax and development, we're so grateful to Nana Akua, to CSPS, to GETSPA, to the University of Ghana for not just allowing us to be in Ghana, but also inviting us to your wonderful campus. It would not be possible without you. And I think I speak to those participants who've been kind of out and about in Accra the last couple of days, that people have really been enjoying the city. We don't have 31 different countries like GETSPA. I think we've got at least over a dozen different countries represented here today. It's not quite easy to get everybody into Ghana, so we're really grateful for your help in making that work, and really excited that we get to do this joint panel. So in the spirit of that kind of joint approach, I want to talk a little bit about a research project that Nana Akua is also PI on amongst her various activities, which is a project on a class text informal sector. So this project is developing out of a research partnership between CSPS and ISER at the University of Ghana, as well as an organization called WIGO, which stands for Women in Informal Employment Organizing and Globalizing and Organizing TD. The project's been going on for a couple of years now. So I've been grateful to have been a guest in Accra a couple of times now. And we got funding for another 5 so you're not getting rid of me anytime soon. Somebody who hasn't been bored to death by me about this already, it might seem like a bit of an oxymoron. We often, don't traditionally think of people in the informal sector as paying taxes. And if we're looking at where national revenue is coming from kind of a macro level, informal economies are not often the first thing we think about. But if we think about tax as something that affects people, if we think about it in the context of wider social policy, the vast majority of people who are in employment in Africa are employed in the informal sector or as informal employees within the formal sector. And yet a variety of them make different formal and informal payments. So if we're interested in tax as an intersection between the working people and the state, the relationship between tax and informality becomes really crucial. And there's two very different framings that we often hear about people in informal economies and their engagement with taxation. One is this idea that they're outside of the tax net, that they're almost by definition not taxed, that they are some kind of hidden gold mine waiting to be discovered by revenue authorities across the continent. And at the same time, everybody who's ever talked with anyone in informal employment, anyone who's got a family member in informal employment, anyone who's read anything on this, will know that there are many, many instances of people making some kind of payments, be they formal payments, be they informal payments, be they payments made to national revenue authorities or to municipalities. But these payments can be quite high, and that there can often be quite a high level of coercion involved in it. These payments are not necessarily voluntary. They're not necessarily an impression of the fact that people are excited about paying taxes, but that if they do not pay them, someone will come and lock up their shop. So we think it's not necessarily a question of which one of those stories is true. There's clearly a little bit of truth in both of them. There's clearly a story of some people certainly not paying taxes, and there's certainly some people with relatively high income who are able to operate informally and are not paying things. But there are lots of people in informal employment that are making a variety of payments that can be really significant burden. So we think the key question then is about the distribution. But who is paying and who is not paying, and why, and what are the impacts of that on the wider lives and well-being of people in informal employment? So that's the kind of origin of this project, which started a couple of years ago, and I think, still think that Accra is a really, really important place to study it, because it is in so many ways representative of some of the dynamics and patterns and challenges that we see many other cities across the continent. So I think learning from Accra is really critical here. A couple of years ago, we surveyed 2,700 informal workers. We think that this is the first geographically, spatially representative survey of informal workers and their tax burdens and various payments that they make anywhere in the world. And we think it was really important to do that because it helps us to get at that distribution about who's paying and who isn't and what are the impacts of that. But it's also really important to do that from the beginning with organizations like WeGo that have worked with informal workers in Accra for a really long time to embed this kind of survey work, focus groups and interviews to make sure that we understand what it is we're learning, to put these results in context, I think what we're going to be able to do over the next couple of years as well. And the first is really to say something about the social composition of Accra's informal economy. The first thing that stands out, if you look at the graph on the left, so that's a kind of a brief overview of its social composition, is that many, many people are own account workers, or so kind of enterprises of one, or own account workers that have unpaid family members working with them. That is broadly a feature of informal economies across in India or large parts of South Asia. The other thing that's really, really striking is that the vast majority of people in Accra's informal economy are women. Again, this is a case where Accra is not unrepresentative, but it's a really, really important part. I think Jalia speaking a little bit more in a minute about taxation and gender. And I think if we think about the taxes that women in Africa pay, it's really important to think about, again, this intersection between informality and taxation. The third thing to highlight here is the third little graph there, which looks at the sectoral distribution. And I think it's really important to highlight when we think of informal workers, our mind always goes to city markets first. Almost everybody's got like city market stalls or street vendors in mind. But highlighting that many, many people who are in informal employment are working from home, are doing home-based work, which includes kind of added work within wider value chains at home, as well as domestic labor. I think that's a really, really important thing to highlight because these are the things we often miss. We only work with people who are visible in public space. The other graph on the left, is the right, stage right? on the right over here, is the distribution of income, of gross incomes by people in the informal economy in Accra. And the first thing to highlight here is that this is a highly, highly, highly uneven distribution of income. It should not be surprising to us, but it's a finding to keep in mind for everything else I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes. If we look at the top income quintile, these are still not terribly high incomes. So the average is roughly kind of, my understanding is where a primary school teacher would be. But obviously there's heterogeneity in there. And there are a couple of people in the top income quintile that are making a relatively good money. But the bottom quintiles, and not just the bottom quintile, but also the second one underneath, are really far below the poverty line. And it's really important to think about those when we talk about the impacts of taxes that informal workers pay in a second. The next finding is what we've kind of called the taxed informal economy. It's pointing out that despite the fact that people often think that people in informal employment are not paying any taxes, the majority of them are making some kind of payment. Some of those are formal taxes paid to the Ghana Revenue Authority. That includes, for example, this includes payments like business licenses and license fees towards the municipal assembly, as well as a variety of other fees made to third parties, such as private owners of markets. What we have not included in this are informal taxes. So all of these are formal taxes alone. Informal taxes come on top of that. We find that people higher income spectrum are a little bit more likely to make some kind of payment, but that a lot of the people in the bottom income quintiles are still making payments. So these are a lot of people who are in the kind of below the poverty line, who in any reasonable tax system will not be making any payments, are making quite substantial payments. Too much, but they're to highlight one other findings which we find, which is that where your store is located, where your place of work is located, is the key deciding factor to predict whether you're making a payment or not. If you're located in a market, you're way more likely to make a payment than if you are working from home. If you're located in a store, you're way more likely to make a payment than if you're located in the street. So whether you're making a payment or not often has a lot less to do with your income than it does whether you're visible to agents of the state. Now for the pièce de résistance, so why does all of this matter? Why is this relevant from a social policy perspective? Is this graph on the left. Probably highlights the relative income that people are making as tax payments. It's split by gender, which makes it a little bit confusing to read, but the pattern broadly holds across men and women, which is that as a proportion of their income, people in the lowest income quintile are making by far the highest payments. And as a proportion of their income, people in the income quintile are making by far the lowest payments. There's substantial heterogeneity there. Some people are paying a percent of their income taxes. The iteration of people in tax. Some of them not necessarily big. There's often a sense that someone is coming to your store and enforcing this tax payment. It's not necessarily a question of voluntary compliance. And in the interviews and focus groups that we've had, this, has led to a very understandable frustration with the system, with a sense of unfairness, with a sense of inequity and inequality. And I think as we move into the next part of this project, we really want to take this moment as a starting point and say, okay, we know there is payment. We know there are expectations of services. What are the consequences of that? What does this mean now for trust in the state? What does this mean now for negotiating a social contract? One of the variables that we asked people was, okay, like, is it better to pay a bit more taxes if you then get better services? And, quite a few people actually say yes. But then ask, if the state offered you better services, a lot of people say no to that. So I think trying to on going forward, I think it's some of the key questions that hopefully we'll be answering in collaboration with CSPS in the coming years. And hopefully there's an argument here that for impact in its wider societal and political impact, informal economies can be a really good microcosm to study these dynamics. And yeah, looking forward to do a bit more of that in the coming years. Thank you very much.
All right then. Who are you passing the baton on to, Max? Okay. They'll project it on that side. What is that? Okay.
So I'm Colette Nyirakamana. I work as research lead for LogRi. LogRi is a program of the ICTD. I'm a trained political scientist, and I've been working on local taxation, let's say taxes that are mobilized at the local level by many local governments. And we have been working in the local program mainly with property tax. So of course, property tax is sometimes raised by central government agencies in some countries, and the revenues are transferred to local governments. But in many cases, it's local governments that raise those revenues. And what I would like to talk here about is really more of the politics and the social aspects or societal aspects of property taxation. I guess it's really important here to talk about, because we know that when you own a house, you should pay taxes. Of course, the local government is able to capture you in the tax net. And this is really a tax that affects people. I'm building my house and you're taxing me on this, something has to happen, right? So I hope you like the presentation. So why taxes more broadly? Because this is one of the major underperforming local taxes in many, many African countries, of course, more broadly lower income countries, despite an extensive revenue potential. And through that underperformance, what has happened is that governments with the support of donors have tried to improve performance by focusing on capacity building, equipping local governments with all sorts of tools and supports to be able to raise that tax, but really focusing on the technical and capacity as well as sometimes technological aspects of that. And we have heard a lot about IT systems are going to be a panacea to weak performance, but we know that this hasn't really worked because we still see underdevelopment in many cases, simply because the tax is not raised properly. So what we came to understand, this is through our research within Logri, but also when we talk to government, is that property tax is strongly connected to some social aspects, as I say, as well as political aspects. Now, this is because tax is also linked to revenue services. If we do investments in revenue services in a specific neighborhood, that is going to increase property values. And obviously, I can sell my property at a higher rate. And if the government is efficient enough, they can also be able to raise more revenues. And we assume that more revenue raised means also providing more services. But again, this is not the case. So this direct link can elicit lots of social reactions, as taxpayers may need to know exactly what the revenues are, the money that they're paying are doing, or in order to be able to comply with taxation. But again, what we see rather is really low levels of tax compliance. And on the politics side as well, we know that high value properties tend to pay more taxes, of course, if the system is progressive. But we also know that those who own those high value properties are often economic elites, political elites, and there can be a lot of resistance. But it's not only from that. We can also see resistance, as I said, more broadly by taxpayers in general. I think I have heard that a lot in Ghana, where people don't want to pay taxes because they don't receive services. Garbage collection is really a simple service here that we can think about. There have been a lot of resistance from taxpayers to pay for that service. Now, so I'm going just to go specific details about how we see this public resistance and what it has really done. As I said, we see generalized low levels of tax compliance. That's in all the countries in Africa. Most of the time, local governments raise about 10% of their revenue targets, sometimes 50%, but they don't. A few governments can go above that unless they try to change the targets to show that performance is high. And we also see that more generally, performance is really between 0.01% of GDP and 0.4% of GDP in many countries. When you think about higher income countries, the rate is around 2% of GDP. So really in African countries, the rate is low. And as I said, local governments fail to meet their revenue targets. So what we see now is really a vicious cycle where you have low levels of compliance, which lead to low revenues. Low revenues really make governments unable to provide enough services, and the cycle continues. And I guess if we also put this in the perspective of taxation being based also on a social contract, then this social contract in some ways has been broken. So that's really one of the issues. The second issue, as I said here, is really the resistance. I think I won't go into the details here, but perhaps I can do it a little bit. simply because we can think about political decision-making when it comes to try and reform the system. And we see that there is a lot of resistance to really try and improve the system, although we know the benefits of that. And as I say, that resistance can come from political elites, simply because having a performing system can be politically costly. It means you manage to tax more, and you also touch sometimes those who are probably likely to resist taxation or who tend to fund your campaigns and everything. Perhaps you don't want to go there. Or I heard in Accra that sometimes politicians also approach the informal sector for votes. So maybe if you have people also on low value properties and more in that sector, of course, they won't want to push for that taxation. So there's a lot of political resistance from political elites. And again, within the administration, when we think about it too, performance has benefited these countries' administrators, simply because you may have rather informal systems that lead to revenue leakage. And when you reform the system, you seal those leakages, and often like that. And the last point that I said here is that there has been a lot of resistance from taxpayers simply because they don't see benefits when it comes to payments, in exchange for payments. And of course, it's in research, but I think, again, when we speak to people, we understand that they are willing to pay taxes. They're really willing to do that as long as they get something in return. So really, it shows how resistance is very strong when it comes to taxation. Now, the question has really rather built trust. Spoke about trust. I think in taxation is really key, but also to ignite more political commitment for reform or to improve the systems. And what we have been doing in our research, but also working with governments, is that if political actors are thinking about the reform, they need to map out the political context to understand, okay, if I am to improve this system, who is likely to resist? And if I have a specific group of people likely to resist, what kind of incentives can I put in place to be able to bring them on board and secure their buy-in? And the second aspect, again, is really linking revenues with services to be able to gather enough support from taxpayers. And I think it goes back to the redistributive aspect of the revenues. You gather revenues, you may need to find a way of really redistributing them in a fairly way. So when we think about linking revenues with services, of course, governments approach that in different ways. Sometimes in the legislation, there are even specific mentions of government should spend a specific portion of revenues for services. Sometimes, like to give an example, actually, it's in Ghana, Shama municipality. Yes, a reform that was put in place. And what they did was to adopt a transparent budgeting and allocation strategy, basically putting aside a portion of the revenues to be used for specific projects. And so what we heard is before the pandemic, the political leadership was willing to reform the system because they felt that they needed more revenues. And to do that, they really relied on engagement with taxpayers. They really relied on, of course, gathering enough political support within the municipality, but also being able to involve taxpayers in the decision-making. So, for instance, they will create campaigns to invite taxpayers to be able to express their priorities, exactly what do they want, invite them when it comes to, let's say, deciding on a project that has to be implemented, share with those taxpayers how much the project will cost, the contractor, everything related to the project, track the process. And when taxpayers need more information about how the project is going, they were able to do that. So really a lot of sensitization, a lot of engagement was done to really ignite trust first, that at least the revenues that we're paying are being used for something that makes sense, that we're also part of the process, and the services that are being implemented are really what we are prioritizing. Another way that governments do it, it's a photo that you see here, it's Lagos, where governments have tried to post the streets on the billboards that your taxes are doing this. So they'll post a project saying that your taxes have built this overpass or something like that. So okay, these are some of the aspects. The last, another way of uniting trust and public support for taxation is also earmarking revenues. Although this sometimes is a very tricky method, sometimes complicated to implement if you don't have strong oversight. Earmarking of revenues is also where you set a portion of the revenues, either from property taxes, or maybe if you don't have enough from taxes, or you just don't want to associate those earmarkings to just property taxes, you then earmark a specific share from all revenues. Then taxpayers decide what kind of services they want. This can be done also through participatory budgeting and then implement that project. And of course, monitoring oversight is always important. And at the end of the day, as long as systems are not built to increase more accountability and transparency, then taxpayers will always resist. And in this case, again, when it comes to transparency and accountability related to property taxation, being clear about how property values are, let's say, being assessed. We know that when you have to tax a property, you need to assess the value of the property, apply a tax rate, and then be able to tax. And we understand that high value properties pay more taxes, low value properties pay less taxes. But we have seen cases where there have been also subjective taxation. And I think it goes back to the point where sometimes those who own low value properties tend to even pay more money than those who own high value properties. Transparency is important in this case, so again, to be able to build trust by showing taxpayers exactly how the tax liabilities have been calculated. And of course, again, as I said at the end, engagement, making sure that taxpayers are part of the process is really key here. So I guess I can stop here for now. And if you have questions, let me know. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Colette. And thank you to everybody in the room and online for staying on and strong through 4 presentations. Actually, 3 presentations. I don't think mine was a presentation. Mine was an introduction. So we have one more, and I hope that you are thinking through the comments and questions that you might have. So Jalia, don't forget your self-introduction, please.
Yes. So thank you. First of all, thank you to our hosts and fellow panelists. My name is Jalia Kangave. I'm an associate research fellow with the International Center for Tax and Development. I work on 2 contradictory areas. On the one hand, I work in general tax, very much an extension of the informal sector, which is highly taxed. On the other hand, I work taxing high net worth individuals who are also very informal, but not taxed as much. So, but today I'll be talking about mostly at some of our work at the ICTD, but also drawing from work from a few other organizations. So why gender and tax? And we started working on this topic in 2016. And the reason we thought it was important to situate our debate in the context is that at that time, a lot of the work on gender and tax was in high-income countries where we felt that the experiences were different from the experiences in African countries. But then we found that there could be gender impacts of taxation, which are different between women and men as a result of a number of things. Sometimes it's how they participate in the economy. So if you participate, like, you know, in what we've seen in as the informal sector, it's also about how who's represented in that informal sector, who's most represented in places like markets, but also how's the enforcement against people within that that part of the economy. It also could be about the income levels, right? How taxes affecting high income earners vis-a-vis how they affect low income earners. And then how individuals spend their money. So are you spending your money on things that are highly taxed as opposed to consumption of things which are more which have lower taxes or no taxes at all, and also biological issues, which we'll talk about soon. So this pictorial is always, I'm always nervous when we're showing it to any economists or statisticians. It's from a paper that my colleagues Vanessa van den Bogaert and Anuradha Joshi wrote on gender and tax, and it's not based on actual figures. And we sort of exaggerate the sort of the differences. And this, it's likely to be different in different contexts. But essentially, we wanted something like a sort of visual to show, like, where do we see the gender issues as far as taxation is concerned. And you'll see at the bottom, which is the lower quintile, you'll see like informal taxes, like huge payments in informal taxes, VAT and excise, and then there's that remaining income. And then you see as you go higher up, you see probably more men and women paying things like wealth tax, personal income taxes, and things like that. So again, not ideal, but the whole idea was let's have some visual to see where do we see the gendered impacts of taxation. I'm going to talk, we've done a lot of work on gender and tax. Well, not that much, but we've tried to do some work, and it covers very many different areas. There's some work that we've done on tax compliance. There is work that we've done in markets, tax administration. But for purposes of this discussion, I'll focus on three things, which again very much mirror some of what Max was talking about home-based market vendors and street vendors in some ways. So I just called it market stall, a household, and a small shop. I want to start with work, an ICTD paper on taxation in markets in Dar es Salaam. And basically this study was done in 9 markets in Dar es Salaam. And they were trying to understand, what are the gender differences as far as taxation is concerned. And I am now going to talk about informal taxes, presuming that after Max's discussion, I don't have to go ahead and explain what these mean. Essentially, what they found was, as far as market fees were concerned, so the fees that all market traders pay, it was between 100 to 200 Tanzanian shillings, right? So they found little evidence of any gender biases as far as that was concerned. But what was more interesting were the toilet taxes, because for every visit that you made to the toilet, you were paying between 200 to 300 Tanzanian shillings. Now, the men would go and use the bush, right? But the women had to either use, the toilets and pay every time, or remember, you're there for 13 hours, or you simply hold your bladder and you don't use the toilet. So here we saw, like, we again, and that's why we're always talking about how do we understand taxation from, remove it from the mainstream and think about what are the actual fees, but what are the levies that different men and women pay in the economy. So it was found that, women were paying up to 18 times in terms of toilet fees as much as they were paying in market taxes. So they actually didn't mind the market fees a lot, but this whole payment that you're making to visit the market, and it ended up being about 20% of their daily income compared to about 13% of men. So men was a lot as well, but women are paying almost double that as far as market fees are concerned. The second one is again a study by a colleague, I've talked about Vanessa, but it's a study in Sierra Leone, and this one is actually looking at households. So it was based on 2 surveys. There's a survey of 1,100 households. 39% of those are female-led households. And another one is 844 households, 40% of which were female-headed households. And it's in 9 chiefdoms in Sierra Leone. So in that study, as you will see from that from those graphics, you see that men are paying more, like a higher percentage of men, 56%, compared to 52% of women are paying formal taxes. Having said that, relative to their income, women are still paying more as far as formal taxes are concerned. So for every $10 that they're paying, women are paying 94 cents, while men are paying 73 cents. So while on the whole, men are more affected, you still see that relative to income, women are spending more. And then when it comes to informal taxes, so some of the things that Marx talked about, things like accessing health and education and water. Informal taxes, a higher percentage of female-headed households at 40% compared to male-headed households, 35% are paying. And again, when you start looking at it as far as a share to the income is concerned, women are paying 61 cents to $10, while men are paying 38 cents. There was one exception in that case when it came to the poll tax, right? Which as far as the poll tax was concerned, men were paying more, and even when women were supposed to pay, their male relatives were making that payment for them. So again there you see a bit of a distinction as far as that is concerned. The third study it's not an ICTD study, but it's a study undertaken by a CSO called Siatini, which Siatini, Uganda, and they're looking at the taxation of small businesses in Kampala. And for that study, it was a survey of 511 small businesses. 51% of these were female businesses, while 49% were male businesses. And again, it gets back to what kind of taxes and fees do we see those in the informal sector paying. And 23% of the respondents were paying central government taxes, mostly in the form of presumptive taxes, compared to 70% of them paying trade licensing fees. And when you check the 70% who are paying trade licensing fees, 80% of these, 80% of women were paying when compared to 60% of men. And then we talked about other taxes that they pay. So you find that a significant percentage of all the respondents, 69%, paying garbage collection fees. So these are the other kind of informal taxes. Where you see two interesting gender biases when it comes to this study. One is when it comes to trade licensing fees. And so the trade licensing fees in Kampala and the type of business, they're not based on the size of the business. So as long as we're running the same kind of business, you might have a much larger business, but as long as we're in the same kind of trade, we're retail shop, I'm going to pay the same as you. And that's where you see the gender differences, because women were more likely to own smaller businesses, but they're paying the same rate. However, men who are represented in transport sector, right? One interesting one was when it came to association taxes that they were paying, and there was this payment that was made to informal agents, right? They're not government agents, but essentially this enables you to it determines where in the queue your car is, right? As you're waiting to take on passengers. So you could say that, oh, that's not a tax, they don't have to pay. The thing is, if you don't pay it, then you're moved behind. So people can make 3 rounds or 4 rounds and you're still there. So that was the most significant part that was seen as affecting women. So why does this matter? It doesn't seem like a crowd that we have to convince, right, on this, but again, just to highlight. And the first one is the fact that these taxes are regressive, right? So like I said, there are quite a number of studies out there. Max has mentioned the study that they've worked on with partners in Ghana, on self-employed informal workers. ICTD has also worked on some studies in Zimbabwe, for example, and you see the regressive nature. So, for example, there's a study that was conducted in markets in Zimbabwe, and there, unlike the case of Tanzania, in there they found that regardless of the income, the market traders were paying a specific market fee, and so women ended up being more affected by this because they had smaller items, they were making less money, so it was regressive in nature. And then they also went ahead and compared what is paid in those markets vis-a-vis if someone had been earning employment income, so personal income taxes. And again, that they find that the tax in the market, the tax rates are way higher. So again, what we're talking about, it seem like small taxes, but they do have a big impact in the sense that they take up a significant percentage of the income. And the reason why it matters is that these taxes affect women's health, as we were saying. You know, if a number of times I've said, oh, you know, don't talk about the toilet taxes, they're wrong and everything, and they're not taxes. But we said, you know, we'll continue calling them taxes until something is done about them. Because if a woman is not going to use the toilet, then you're thinking about, you know, all the infections that she's getting, thinking about the dehydration and how long she's spending in the market and how hot it is in the market. So all these things are then affected by taxes. And then lastly, they are inequitable because, you know, it's very common to hear that the informal sector doesn't pay taxes, But a lot of the work that we're doing actually shows that the informal sector pays huge amounts. While on the other hand, when we look at people like high net worth individuals, they're paying very little. So again, it becomes important because of the inequitable nature of the tax system. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you all. So we have just a short time for questions and comments, discussions in general. Yes, and I'm going to ask you to keep it like really short. Okay. Nana Sapu, have we figured out the mic issue? So grab a mic close to you. It's important so that those online can actually hear. And which other hands were up? Do you have a mic close to you? Make sure you have one close to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fortunato Bonili. I'm from Nigeria. I work with the FCT Internal Revenue Service. So my question goes like this, is in twofold. In the pursuit of tax efficiency, the property tax be paid by the property owners or by the occupiers of the properties, which may be tenants. The second one is considering the level of town planning in most sub-Saharan African countries, the property tax be paid only by properties which were built on lands that were legally allocated and built on or by whatever property is being occupied. Thank you.
Okay. So let's get to a collection of questions then to be more efficient. Yes. Once the lights up here, then that means we can hear you okay.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Isaac Frimpong, and I have two questions. One is on the property tax. You mentioned the challenges that goes on for difficulty in government getting property tax. But could it be because that in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the public problems are solved by private solutions? Because if there are no social housing, I find a way to build my house. So why do you want to come and tax me? Is it out of the reasons why people find difficulty in paying property tax? And two, I had informal economy, formal economy. I think we have only one economy. So is there a possibility where you said that we should move away from well-being to human flourishing? And now and say we have non-standard form of employment and standard form of employment, because when you talk about informal economy, it's about workers, own account workers, people who work from house or they're contributing family members, they're all workers. I think when we move away that language, I think it will help us to see that they are in non-standard form of employment, so we can find a way to let them be more productive. Where in terms of taxes, we move away from same as informal, formal taxes. So informal, are they fees or they are informal tax? So the word informal and formal sometimes cloud judgment as social policy researchers. So that's is a contribution of question. Thank you.
Sounds like both, and thank you very much. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Hanel. So you say yours was not a presentation, but it was really interesting. The introduction.
To hear you.
Very.
I don't know whether it's the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. So like you say, yours was just an introduction, but it was extremely interesting, where you have economic policy takes center stage and social policy has been like, it's a secondary consideration. So my question to you is that why is that? Why is there this minimalist approach social policy? Is it because of lack of knowledge? Is it because of lack of political will to be able to consider additional investment in prioritizing social policy? On the second presentation, this link between the electricity tax and Airbnb, I mean, is there any data on the Airbnb side that we can see the increase in the consumption of it? When did this increase really start? Was it after the 20% tax was imposed? It's not very clear to me that link contribute the growth in Airbnb only because of the tax that was imposed on electricity. And then on the third presentation, this transparent budgeting and initiative, did it actually lead to increase in revenue? Did it lead to higher levels of compliance because of this initiative or this project that was implemented in Ghana? These are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more. Because I don't think each person is overloaded with questions yet. So yes, one more. Yes.
My question goes to Dr. Opoku. Well, the title was Beyond the Money, but at the end of the day, the explanation I heard was all about money. So where is Beyond the Money? That yes, I want to know.
Okay. I'm going to start because I think Isaac's comments dealt with the introduction and this whole situating our interest as social policy researchers on well-being. I wasn't thinking of human flourishing as a shift. I was just saying that I prefer that term, well-being, as the preferred outcome of social policy making refers to people's needs being met, their problems being solved, and then their opportunities being maximized. If you think about it all together, it's about you having a full life, a flourishing life, a thriving life. And I just prefer that term because I feel well-being doesn't capture what we want to have in life. We want our lives to flourish. So that's that. I think some of my comments Max can probably address, but I disagree with you that there is one economy. Reasons because if we in Ghana, even though our economy is, we make policies as if we have an economy that is similar to economies elsewhere when it isn't the case. So we make policies about social security. But social security as we have it now is very much employment. Therefore, you can have people in the informal economy even when they are in a formal sector. I think it's important to have that distinction because if we don't, then a lot gets lost. We make a lot of assumptions which are harmful to the majority of people who have to live, make a living, work within our societies, within our economies. And I'm sure other people have some thoughts on that, so I'll leave it to them. Oh, why social policy is sort of secondary residual. I tried to explain that it's the dominance of a neoliberal approach. So it's an ideological perspective. There's no science per se to it. It's not the way that it should be. It's the way that we have decided it ought to be. And we're arguing that it doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, why don't we just go down this way? Kwadwo and then Colette.
Thank you. So taking it from the last, so where is the beyond the money? We find out that everything is about the money, of course.
But the point is, after you get your money, what is the effect of the tax that you impose? If you're a tax policy, do you consider those effects, whether they are socially acceptable or not? So, and availability of Airbnb in their private locations is very common. Of course, we don't have that data over there, but we can see that since around 2019, this keeps on, going on, and at the same time, the formal accommodation industry, it is performing. That the data is showing. So that clearly shows that something is happening. But of course, we need to do more in order to restrict any other factors that may be. My proposal is that the non-neutral tax, and therefore people are taking advantage of it as usual. We are human beings. So when you see it, you just go and operate over there to do what you want. And then the final thing is property that should it be owners or tenants. So you say, I think it's supposed to be paid by the owners. But when the owners, then we can say that they are the direct people who are paying, they can transfer the tax. But of course, if the owner occupies house, the owner is occupying, you don't say that he's not paying anything. So he's not supposed to pay. So even though he's not earning any income from it, you have to calculate how much you have paid, for example, as a rent. And that's why he needs to pay the property tax, whether it is he occupied it or subletted. We know that if he subletted, then tenants may, if it is not 100%, they may transfer some of the tax to the tenants. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your questions. I'll also respond on the first question about, in the interest of tax efficiency, is it better to tax the occupant or find the owner? So in our research, we have seen that countries tend to have different at least two systems. The first system is that policy has to be legally registered to be taxed. It means that the tax authority needs to find the owner, needs to locate the plot, get the plot number, and usually it's through the Ministry of Lands, land titling agencies, and everything like that. And once you have that information, you can then start assessing the value of the property and tax the owner. In other countries, that's something that happens in Sierra Leone, and Uganda has an in-between system. The legislation doesn't really compel tax authorities to legally identify the owner. What they will say is, as long as you can identify the property, assess the value, and then distribute the bill. If while you're identifying the property and registering it, you manage to find the name of the owner, great, add them to this to your database. But if you can't, tax the supposed owner of the property without having a name. Usually in Ghana, I think they call it occupant of the property. My husband received a bill for that and he didn't pay it because they couldn't really know his name. But the thing is, some countries just distribute the bill to the occupant as long as they have been able to identify the property. And this is because local governments need revenues. And usually when you go through this system of just identifying the properties, you can easily maybe compel the owners who receive the bill to go and pay. Unlike a system where you have to go through the Ministry of Lands or land titling agencies to get information about ownership and then be able to build your property records. So I hope this answers your question. Maybe the risk of distributing the bill to the occupant is that when it comes to enforcement, it can be difficult, post payment. So at this time, I guess the tax authority can do two things: identifying properties and over time also try to get the names as we go. On the question of whether only legally registered lands should be taxed or all occupied lands, I guess we can think about delivery. And I think in many countries, you have sometimes dual systems, systems where you have state properties that when the legislation says that as long as you have a property on this state-owned land, you have to pay taxes. While when you have property on customary land, usually exempted from taxation. That's the case of Zambia. But I think in Ghana, you don't have that distinction. Lands, whether they are customary lands or state-owned lands, as long as yeah, exactly. But in Zambia, there is this distinction. So what our colleagues found was that taxpayers who are on these customary lands are demanding services to the tax authority, but they don't pay taxes because the legislation doesn't push them to pay taxes. And traditional chiefs don't also want push for taxation. So they were working to try and find a way of changing the legislation so that all properties, regardless of the land tenure system can pay taxes because, again, we think about service delivery at the end. And it brings me to the question about private aspects of taxation. Should we pay taxes because we are building our properties and government is coming to tax us? And in the discussion we have had in many countries, of course, it goes back to the colonial origins of property taxes. And people tend to just resist because this was somehow a violent tax, a very compelling tax. And I don't think there was this counterpart where you receive services when you pay taxes. But as we go and as hopefully government needs money and can tax efficiently, but also be able to redistribute depending on, where the needs are, we believe that property tax is also a good tax that you can easily, where you can easily raise enough revenues and be able to provide services. And because, as I said, this has a direct effect on your property values and also the services that you can easily receive. So perhaps, yes, why not taxing properties if you can? And on the last point about trust and all the efforts that were done in Shama to be able to core revenues increased by 50%, which is good. And property taxes had an increment of 15 every year from 2019. The last assessment we did was in 2022. But of course, we can't just think that trust is the key aspect. It is one of the aspects only. Enforcement is always also useful. As I said, political commitment is always also important. And of course, investing in capacity. So it's a combination of many factors, but key here is really to make sure that taxpayers are willing to pay and they trust that you are using the revenues for what they think they need. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't know that I have any question directly specific.
Well, I'm sure there might be questions coming in the next round, so you can pass it to Max.
I'll just comment briefly on the issue of the informal sector and in some ways we still struggle with that as researchers, and you hear arguments about how can you talk about the informal sector when, for example, those people are registered with the local authority, and I think we're still trying to juggle with what's the best term to use. I think for me, what gives me more of a tummy ache, other than the term itself, is how it is used as a political tool to go against smaller businesses. When a lot of our work on taxing high net worth individuals is showing that actually there is a big informal sector within the formal sector, right? And so I think if we can move our focus to that, because if we say that small businesses are registered, but then we also know, and Colette, you were talking about property taxes, we also know as far as rental income tax is concerned, you see the big buildings there, but somehow they can't make it to a register. So I think until we address those practical issues, that becomes sort of, it's an imperfect term to use, but it serves a certain purpose.
Informal economies and how they define it. If anyone ever has a night where they really need to sleep, I've got like a 45-page paper on this, and it will send you to sleep. I mean, the terminology is a mess, right? It's been a mess from the beginning, and there are a variety of different things by which we can distinguish economic activities, and there's never really been a full agreement on what we mean, and people have, I think, weaponized taking one definition over the other to make ideological points and so on. So it is a mess. I don't think that means we should get away from it. I think I agree exactly with what Nana Akua said, which is we don't have one informal economy. We have a variety of different types of informality across different categories, and it's important to highlight that. It's especially important to highlight that when we start thinking about policy interventions around formalization, because if you talk to people who represent informal workers, they're very excited about formalization. But when they hear formalization, they hear better infrastructure, better working conditions, something to show the police when they try to kick them away. You talk to revenue authorities about formalization, they get like little dollar signs behind their eyes. So I think just highlighting what we mean by that can help us a little bit with the definitions, but I'm also very sympathetic to the fact that, it's a mess.
Time to tackle. While I get maybe two more questions from in-house. So yes, please. Very smart of you to draw a mic to you. You could do that. Grab a mic. And then you, okay, so those will be the last three comments, in addition to Profi's comments online.
So I have
Go ahead.
thank you very much, and thanks the presenters for the
Could you speak up a little bit?
presentations. Yeah, two quick questions. One, I think it's to Colette. Yeah, what should come first? I mean, it's more of a chicken and egg thing. If, for instance, a local authority in Kenya, we have counties. If a local authority wants to introduce a tax, like property tax on land or a house, but they don't provide a service. Case in Kenya where residents have taken the county to court because they want to be taxed, but the county does not provide security, no roads, no water, no electricity, nothing. They organize among themselves to provide these services. So what should come first? Should it be the local authority provides a service and then say, now you should pay for it? Or should they first tax you and then say, okay, we will think about giving a service at a later stage? Then my second question is on what constitutes a tax. I think this is 2 marks. I've had a lot of challenges in terms of what really is a tax. So you have levies, you have rates, you have service fees. To the ordinary person, it's a cost on them. But to the local authority and to the Kenya Revenue Authority, for instance, or any other revenue authority, they don't define that as
Okay.
tax. So what do you need to like that?
Thank you very much. Let me go here and then, yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask the presenter who made a presentation on property tax. Among others, he mentioned building public and political support, identifying and addressing resistance as some of the solutions. But then as revenue authorities, we are having it a hard time because even lobbying the politicians, most of who own the properties in the cities is becoming hard. So I wanted to know, are there case studies where have worked and we have properly defined property taxes, especially here in sub-Saharan Africa? The same with informal tax. Maybe I may just go to Max and ask, because there's also this argument that says the cost of operating informal taxes, especially for revenue authorities, is higher than the collection that is made from the informal taxes. Yet we are seeing institutions such as IMF are pushing tax authorities. They are saying they are untapped taxes, and we are not doing better in tapping them. Yet when we compare the resources that we put in order to find the informal taxes, it is highly costly for us. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And finally.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Jonathan. I'm coming from Zambia, actually, and I work in tax authority. You talked about non-compliance of taxpayers, which is a big issue in many developing countries, actually. And you raised the point where you're talking about resistance from the taxpayers and also comparing what the government is providing. And so you talked about a suggestion whereby on how to deal with this resistance of non-compliance in terms of taxpayers, where you're talking about earmarking of taxes. Now, I'm thinking, how feasible is it that this particular suggestion would work, where taxpayers decide what projects the government would, because you look at most governments in Africa, they are debt burdened and they have different responsibilities. So how feasible is this particular suggestion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to project it's more of a comment, but these are really big questions. How can developing countries prioritize and deliver social services within the context of austerity programs? And therefore, is there any way out for improving tax morale? Who wants to take a shot at that? But the catch is that you have to do it really, really shortly. Colette, you had a lot of questions coming at you. I suspect that's because these are middle class folks. So of all the things that have been said, most personal to them is property tax. I'm struggling to build my house, and now the government wants to tax me. But the good thing is that these are all your people. You're going to be in a bus with them, so you can give them the long answer then. Give us a short answer now. All right. So let's start with you.
So I'll be able to respond in more details. So did I take good notes? Yes. First question about properties on land and okay, what comes first? We provide this, it varies, and what we are learning is that as long as governments are transparent, even if they don't have revenues, but they say, okay, please trust us, they're transparent and they can compel taxpayers to trust them, or rather convince taxpayers to trust them that if they raise taxes, they will be able to use revenues transparently. I believe that taxpayers can be willing to comply. And of course, this has to be maintained over time. We can talk about the court case, but this was a case of rich people who were also somehow compelling Nairobi to get the services that they want. But I think it's more complex than that. Now, revenue authorities having a hard time taxing people because of the politics. This is also a thing, and there is a successful case, the case of Freetown. We have a lot of publications on this on the ICTD website. You can read about it. And it's just a case of a mayor who was very determined to transform Freetown. And one way to do that was to raise property tax revenues because of the potential. And of course, because of that political motivation, of course, she navigated a lot of resistance, but the reform ended up working. And key here was to also enforce taxation on those who own high value properties to show that you can get away with taxation. So if you do that with the rich, and the poor will also comply, and then you can provide services. They are testing participatory budgeting as well to be able to earmark revenues on specific services. Earmarking, how feasible is it? It's easy, but sometimes difficult to implement at the same time. We are recommending that to full councils in Malawi. Will happen maybe in a year or two. We can talk about it, but I think it's one of the ways to earmark revenues, and maybe there's a lot to say, so maybe I won't go into so much details, but we can discuss this later. I think that's all from me. Yes, I'll stop here. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, got like 4 questions. I'll try to be very quick. First of all, I've got a question to the room. Unless there's something like Kofi, I don't know. We only had questions from men. What happened? Do better. Michael, what is a tax? It's the question I get every time I present. And yours was the kindest and friendliest version of that. Usually it's a revenue official yelling at me that I'm calling something a tax, which isn't a tax. So I think the broader argument we make is for something that is an official tax that's collected by the revenue authority is also true for other payments. We tend to look at a broader universe of payments, partly because I think to understand the livelihoods and situations of informal workers, it's important to do that. But also partly it's extremely difficult for them to make that distinction, often for good reasons, because the people they interact with don't always make that distinction. The people who collect these taxes don't always make that distinction. So we tend to look at a broader universe. But I think the arguments we're making are also true if you look at the narrower universe. Cost of collection, yeah, absolutely. Cost of collection for presumptive tax is extremely high. The amount of manpower involved in collecting presumptive taxes is extremely high, and the revenue collected from them is quite limited. Where we don't have enough studies on that yet, and we are hopefully in the beginning of starting one in Ghana, which will be very exciting. If you push revenue officials on this, they often then highlight that, it's not just about the revenue, it's about other things. So I think one of the really productive things to have is a conversation saying, okay, if it's also other things, what are these other things and is it working? Or are the policies working for these other things? Finally, I'll take a swing at Kofi's question on the fixing the big tax compliance service relationship. Just because now Akua started with a kind of wider embedding this in a conversation around social policy and neoliberalism, I am somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of this kind of taxes of the state as only a service provider, and taxes only being important if the state is also a service provider. I think the state is many things beyond just the people that collect your garbage.
So thank you for staying on, and want to thank all of you, coming from the ICTD mostly, but also from the University of Ghana, Dr. Isaac. And I see my student from CSPS, yay, good person. So this has been fantastic, really interesting conversation. I hope we get to continue it even as we go offline. So thank you once again and have a good rest of the day.